The wedding was the scandal of the decade, and every guest in St. George's, Hanover Square knew it. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the altar in a borrowed gown of pale ivory silk, her veil doing little to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Behind her, the whispers rose like a tide. The pews were filled with aristocrats who had come not to celebrate, but to witness humiliation dressed in lace. She could hear them clearly. Lady Ashworth's theatrical murmur about the bride's threadbare gloves, Lord Pemberton's derisive chuckle about desperate spinsters, and the ever-present question that rippled through the congregation like poison through blood. Why would anyone marry the crippled Duke? Eleanor kept her eyes fixed forward, her hands clasped so tightly around her wilting bouquet that her knuckles had gone white. She was 24 years old. Her father had died owing £40,000 to creditors who now circled like vultures. Her mother had taken to her bed 3 years ago and never truly risen, and her younger sister, sweet Margaret with her chestnut curls and trusting heart, needed a future that debtor's prison would destroy before it began. So here Eleanor stood, trading herself for a settlement that would clear every debt, establish her mother in a comfortable cottage in Bath, and provide Margaret with a proper dowry. The contracts had been signed before she ever laid eyes on her groom. And what a groom he was. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, no relation to the gossiping Lady Ashworth in the third pew, though Eleanor had briefly feared otherwise, sat in a wheeled chair to the left of the Archbishop. He did not rise to greet her. He could not rise to greet her. Everyone in London knew the story, or at least the version society had decided to believe. A riding accident 8 years ago had crushed his spine. He had retreated to his estate in Cumberland, a recluse who never appeared in London, never attended Parliament, never danced at balls or dined at White's, or did any of the 1,000 things dukes were expected to do. The gossips called him the Ghost Duke, the Crippled Duke, the Broken Lord, and now he was her husband. Eleanor reached the altar steps and forced herself to look at him properly for the first time. The portraits in the newspapers had not done him justice, or perhaps they had been deliberately unkind. Alexander Blackwood was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too sharp, his jaw too severe, his dark eyes too watchful. His hair was the color of raven wings, untouched by gray despite his 35 years. His shoulders were broad beneath his perfectly tailored charcoal coat, his hands resting motionless on the arms of his chair. But it was his expression that made Eleanor's breath catch. He was not looking at her with pity or disdain or even polite indifference. He was studying her the way a hawk studies a field mouse, with absolute, unnerving focus, as if he could see through her borrowed gown and her brave posture and her carefully composed face to the terrified, desperate woman beneath. "You came," he said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had not needed to speak loudly for a very long time. "You doubted I would?" Eleanor heard herself reply. One corner of his mouth lifted. It was not quite a smile. "I doubted anyone would." The Archbishop cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that barely trembled. The Duke spoke his with the same quiet intensity he seemed to bring to everything. When it came time for the ring, he lifted his hand from the chair arm with visible effort, and Eleanor saw something flicker across his face, pain, or perhaps frustration, before he mastered it. She stepped closer without thinking, meeting his hand halfway. Their fingers brushed, and his skin was warm. The gold band slid onto her finger with an ease that belied the difficulty of the gesture. "Thank you," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. The archbishop pronounced them man and wife. The congregation applauded, with the kind of polite, bloodless enthusiasm reserved for funerals and bankruptcies. And somewhere in the back of the church, a woman laughed, a bright, mocking sound that cut through the organ music like a blade. Eleanor did not turn to see who it was. She kept her eyes on her husband's face, and she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The laugh had not escaped him either. The wedding breakfast was held at Ashworth House, a vast grey stone mansion in Mayfair that had been shuttered for nearly a decade. Servants had opened it only 3 days before, airing out rooms that still smelled faintly of dust and disuse. The ballroom where the guests assembled was lit by what seemed like 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in mirrors draped with black crepe, a mourning custom from the Duke's previous marriage that no one had thought to remove. Eleanor learned about the first Duchess of Ashworth from Lady Margaret Pemberton, who cornered her beside the punch bowl with the predatory smile of a woman delivering devastating news under the guise of friendship. "Surely you knew," Lady Pemberton said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Isabella died 8 years ago, the same month as the Duke's accident. Some say the grief drove him to recklessness on horseback. Others say," she paused delicately, "well, others say he was never the same after, in body or in mind." Eleanor's stomach turned cold. "I was not informed." "No, I don't suppose you would have been." Lady Pemberton's eyes swept over Eleanor's gown with clinical precision. "The settlement was rather generous, I hear. £40,000 for a duke's title is quite the bargain, though I imagine the price included other considerations." Eleanor understood then what the Tun truly thought of her marriage. She was not a bride. She was a purchased commodity, bought to warm the bed of a crippled recluse who could not find a wife among women with better options. The realization should have devastated her. Instead, it ignited something cold and steady in her chest, the same flame that had kept her upright through her father's funeral and her mother's collapse and the endless parade of creditors at their door. She smiled at Lady Pemberton with perfect politeness. "I assure you, the Duke's considerations are entirely his own, though I thank you for your concern. It is so kind of you to take an interest in our happiness." Lady Pemberton's smile flickered. Before she could respond, a footman appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "His Grace requests your presence in the library, Your Grace." "Your Grace." The title felt foreign, like a coat cut for someone else's shoulders. But Eleanor nodded and followed the footman out of the ballroom, away from the whispers and the candlelight and the suffocating weight of 100 judging stares. The library was in the east wing, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling. The Duke sat near the fireplace, his chair positioned to face the door. He had removed his coat and loosened his cravat, and in the softer light, he looked less severe, more exhausted. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a leather armchair across from him. "Before you collapse. You've been on your feet for 4 hours." Eleanor sat. The chair was so deep she felt swallowed by it. "You noticed." "I notice everything." He studied her with those dark, watchful eyes. "Lady Pemberton was informing you about Isabella." It was not a question. Eleanor nodded. "And what conclusion did you draw from her version of events?" "I concluded that Lady Pemberton enjoys cruelty the way other women enjoy embroidery." Something shifted in the Duke's face. That almost smile again, there and gone. An accurate assessment. He paused. Isabella was my wife for 3 years. She died of a fever, not grief or tragedy, or any of the romantic nonsense the gossips prefer. Her death and my injury occurred in the same month, by unhappy coincidence. Nothing more. You did not need to explain. I did. His voice cut through her protest, like a blade through silk. You and I are bound now, for better or worse. I will not have our marriage built on lies and whispers. Whatever you wish to know, ask me. I will answer honestly. Eleanor considered this. The fire crackled in the silence between them. Why did you choose me? She asked finally. You could have had any woman in England for £40,000. A younger woman, a prettier woman, a woman with a title, or connections, or... I did not want a younger woman, or a prettier woman. His eyes held hers. I wanted a woman who understood what it meant to survive. The words hit Eleanor somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she had kept carefully locked away since her father's debts had swallowed everything she loved. I read about you, the Duke continued. After the creditors came, you sold everything. Your mother's jewelry, your father's collection, your own dowry. You negotiated with every merchant your father owed. You found positions for servants who had been with your family for generations. You did not weep or wail or beg for mercy. You simply endured. Eleanor's throat tightened. There was no other choice. There is always another choice. Most people simply lack the courage to make the hard one. He leaned forward slightly, and she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and leather. I am not a husband who will dance with you at balls or escort you through Hyde Park or give you children to dandle on your knee. My body is broken, and I have made my peace with that. But I can offer you protection, security, and absolute honesty. If that is not enough, tell me now. I will not hold you to vows made under duress. No one had ever spoken to Eleanor like this. No one had ever treated her as an equal, as a person with choices, rather than a problem to be solved. What about you? She heard herself ask. What do you want from this marriage? The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I want someone to sit with me in the evenings, he said. Someone who does not flinch when I cannot rise to greet them. Someone who sees me, not my chair or my title or my tragedy. He paused. I have been alone for 8 years, Eleanor. I am tired of silence. And there it was, the truth beneath the rumors, and the mockery, and the cruel laughter at their wedding. The ghost Duke was not a monster, or a recluse, or a broken thing to be pitied. He was simply a man who had been lonely for so long he had forgotten what company felt like. Eleanor reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. I will not flinch, she said, and I am not afraid of silence, but I would rather fill it with conversation, if you are willing. The Duke looked down at her hand on his. For a moment, his expression was utterly unguarded, surprise, wonder, and something that might have been hope. Then the door to the library burst open, and a man strode in without knocking. He was tall and silver-haired, dressed in military uniform, with medals glittering on his chest. His face was weathered and handsome, the face of a man who had spent decades commanding armies and expecting obedience. Alexander, the man said, ignoring Eleanor entirely. We need to talk, now. The Duke's expression shuddered instantly. Whatever vulnerability Eleanor had glimpsed vanished behind a mask of cold control. "Lord General Stratton," he said, "how kind of you to attend the wedding." The general, Eleanor recognized the name now, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, waved a dismissive hand. "I didn't come for the wedding. I came because the situation in Whitehall has deteriorated. The French ambassador is making demands, the Prime Minister is wavering, and the King needs—" "Not here." The Duke's voice cracked like a whip. "Not in front of my wife." The general finally looked at Eleanor. His gaze was assessing, cold, and thoroughly unimpressed. "So this is the Whitfield girl," he said. "I told you it was a mistake, Alexander. Marrying a penniless spinster for sentiment, when you could have secured an alliance with the Radcliffe family. Lord Radcliffe's daughter would have brought us the northern votes we need. The northern votes are already secured." The Duke's tone was ice. "And my marriage is not a subject for debate." "Everything is a subject for debate when the kingdom is at stake." The general stepped closer to the Duke's chair, lowering his voice. "The French have sent someone to London, an agent. We don't know who or what they're planning, but our sources say it involves the succession. The king is not well. You know this as well as I do. If something happens before we're ready, I am aware of the stakes." The Duke's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I will deal with it. You had better, because if you fail, it won't just be your title you lose." The general glanced at Eleanor again, and something ugly flickered in his expression. "It will be everything you've tried to protect." He turned and strode out of the library, without another word. The door slammed behind him, and silence rushed back in, like water filling a void. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, her mind racing. The French, the succession, the king's health, an agent in London, and her husband, her crippled, reclusive husband, at the center of it all. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Really?" Alexander Blackwood looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something like fear in his eyes. "No one you should have been burdened with," he said. "But since you are now my wife, I will tell you the truth, all of it." What followed was a story Eleanor could never have imagined. Alexander Blackwood had not been crippled in a riding accident. He had been attacked. 8 years ago, he had been the king's most trusted advisor, a shadow operative who moved through the courts of Europe, gathering intelligence, negotiating secret treaties, and dismantling threats before they could reach the throne. He had been brilliant at it, invisible and untouchable, until a French agent had discovered his identity. The accident had been an assassination attempt. The horse had been tampered with, the fall precisely calculated. Alexander should have died. Instead, he had survived with a shattered spine and a burning determination to continue his work from the shadows. For 8 years, the crippled Duke had been a cover. While society whispered about his tragedy and his reclusiveness, Alexander had been running a network of spies, informants, and operatives that stretched across every kingdom in Europe. He was the king's shadow, the invisible hand that protected the crown from threats no one else even knew existed. "The chair is real," he said flatly, as if reading her thoughts. "The injury is real. I cannot walk, and I never will again. But I am not helpless, Eleanor. I am far more dangerous than anyone who laughs at our wedding could possibly imagine." Eleanor's mind was reeling. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are my wife now." His voice was grim. "And because Stratton was right about one thing. The situation is deteriorating. There is an agent in London, someone working to destabilize the succession. If they succeed, it will mean war. And if I am to stop them, I cannot have you unknowingly caught in the crossfire. You want me to stay out of your way. I want you to understand what you have married. He met her eyes with that hawk-like intensity. So you can make an informed choice. I will not force you to stay in a marriage that places you in danger. If you wish to leave, to take the settlement, and live quietly, somewhere far from me and my enemies, I will not stop you. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about the creditors and the debt, and her mother's hollow eyes, and Margaret's future. She thought about Lady Pemberton's cruel smile, and the laughter at the church, and the suffocating weight of society's judgment. And then she thought about the man before her, the man who had chosen her not for her beauty, or her connections, or her dowry, but because she understood survival, the man who had been alone for 8 years, because the world believed him broken when he was anything but. No, she said. The Duke's expression flickered. No? No. I will not leave. I will not hide. And I will not let you face this alone. She straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze without flinching. You wanted a wife who understood what it meant to survive. I understand. And I am telling you now, I did not survive everything. I have survived only to run away the moment things became difficult. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her. Then, slowly, his mouth curved into something Eleanor had not yet seen. A real smile, small and tired, and slightly crooked, but genuine. You, he said, are not what I expected. Neither are you, she replied. Now, tell me about this French agent. Tell me everything. And then tell me how I can help. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eleanor could have imagined. By day, she played the role of the Duke's quiet, unremarkable wife. She received callers with polite indifference. She attended tedious luncheons where women like Lady Pemberton made veiled references to her husband's condition and her own sacrifice. She smiled and nodded and gave them nothing, because giving them nothing meant protecting the secret that could not be exposed. By night, she became something else entirely. Alexander's network was vast, but his mobility was limited. He needed eyes and ears in places his chair could not reach. Eleanor, who had spent years navigating creditors and merchants and servants with careful diplomacy, proved remarkably adept at gathering information. She befriended a lady's maid who had once worked for the French ambassador's household. She charmed a clerk in the War Office who had a weakness for pretty smiles and flattery. She attended a musicale at the home of a suspected French sympathizer and memorized every name mentioned in whispered conversations. And every evening, she returned to Alexander and told him everything. They would sit in the library, the fire burning low, maps and letters spread across the table between them. Alexander would listen with that intense focus, asking questions, connecting threads Eleanor had not even noticed. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to assemble a picture of the conspiracy threatening the crown. The agent was someone highly placed, someone with access to the king's schedule, the succession plans, the military deployments along the Channel, someone who had been feeding information to the French for years. Stratton suspects Lord Ashford, Alexander said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. But the evidence doesn't align. Ashford is ambitious, but he's not a traitor. Could Stratton himself be involved? Eleanor asked. The question hung in the air between them. Alexander's expression darkened. I've considered it. Stratton has always resented my influence over the king. He believes I overstepped my position years ago, and that my injury was divine punishment for my arrogance. He paused. But resentment is not treason. I need proof. Then let me find it. He looked at her sharply. No, it's too dangerous. You cannot do this without me, and you know it. Eleanor leaned forward, her heart pounding. Alexander, I have spent my entire life being underestimated. People look at me and see a penniless spinster, a desperate woman who married a crippled duke for his money. They do not see a threat. They will never see me coming. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. If anything happens to you, he said quietly, I will burn this entire city to the ground. Eleanor's breath caught. The words were not romantic. They were fierce and raw and utterly sincere. And in that moment, she realized something that terrified her more than any French agent or political conspiracy. She was falling in love with her husband. The break came on a cold November evening, at a dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Radcliffe, the very family Stratton had wanted Alexander to ally with through marriage. Lady Radcliffe's daughter, Miss Cecilia Radcliffe, had been seated next to Eleanor at dinner. She was beautiful in a cold, polished way, with silver blonde hair and eyes the color of winter ice. She smiled at Eleanor with the kind of sweetness that felt practiced, artificial. You must tell me all about your wedding, Cecilia said, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. I was so disappointed to miss it. I had heard such interesting things. I'm sure you did, Eleanor replied evenly. I confess, I was surprised when the Duke chose you. Cecilia's smile sharpened almost imperceptibly. I had thought, after Isabella, he would never marry again. But I suppose men grow lonely, even broken ones. The casual cruelty of the word, broken, sent a flash of anger through Eleanor's chest. But she kept her expression pleasant, remembering everything Alexander had taught her about concealing her true thoughts. The Duke is many things, she said, but broken is not one of them. No? Cecilia's eyes glittered. How noble of you to defend him. Though I wonder if you would be so devoted if you knew the truth about his first marriage. Eleanor's heart stopped. What truth? Oh, he didn't tell you? Cecilia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Isabella didn't die of a fever. She was murdered, and everyone who knew her believes the Duke was responsible. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a commotion erupted at the other end of the table. A footman had entered the dining room, his face pale with urgency. He bent to whisper in Lord Radcliffe's ear, and whatever he said made the older man's expression turn ashen. Ladies and gentlemen, there has been an incident at the palace. The king has collapsed. The royal physicians are with him now. But the room erupted into chaos. Guests rose from their seats, voices overlapping in panic and speculation. Eleanor's eyes sought Alexander at the head of the table, and she saw his face had gone completely still, the stillness of a man preparing for battle. He caught her gaze and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Wait. And then the dining room doors burst open, and armed soldiers in the king's colors flooded into the room. Lord General Stratton strode in behind them, his medals gleaming in the candlelight. "Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth," he announced, his voice ringing through the stunned silence. "By order of the Crown, you are under arrest for high treason." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "This is absurd." Alexander's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white on the arms of his chair. "On what evidence?" "Evidence provided by a reliable witness." Stratton's gaze swept the room and landed on Cecilia Radcliffe, who had risen from her seat with a triumphant smile. "Miss Radcliffe has testified that she overheard the Duke discussing sensitive information with a known French operative. Furthermore, documents have been discovered in Ashworth House that confirm his involvement in a plot to destabilize the succession." Eleanor's mind raced. Cecilia Radcliffe, the woman Stratton had wanted Alexander to marry, the woman whose father commanded the northern votes. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Cecilia was not simply a rejected suitor. She was the agent. She had been feeding information to the French for years, and when Alexander had chosen Eleanor over her, she had decided to destroy him instead. "You're wrong," Eleanor said, rising from her seat. "The Duke is innocent. Miss Radcliffe is the traitor." The room went silent. Every eye turned to her. Cecilia laughed, the same bright, mocking sound Eleanor had heard at her wedding. "How desperate you are to make such wild accusations. Everyone knows you married the Duke for his money. You would say anything to protect your position." "I married the Duke because he is a good man," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And I am not making accusations. I am stating facts." She turned to Stratton, meeting his cold gaze without flinching. "Miss Radcliffe has been passing information through a lady's maid who formerly worked in the French ambassador's household. The maid's name is Marie Delacroix. She is currently in Miss Radcliffe's employ and can be found at the Radcliffe residence in Berkeley Square. I have correspondence that proves the connection." Stratton's expression flickered. "How could you possibly know this?" "Because I found it," Eleanor said. "Because while the Duke has been protecting this kingdom from the shadows, I have been protecting him. And because if you search the Radcliffe residence tonight, you will find everything you need to prove that the real traitor is standing in this room, smiling at the destruction she has caused." Cecilia's smile had vanished. Her face was pale, her eyes darting toward the door. "Search the house," Stratton ordered one of his officers. "Now." Cecilia made a sudden movement toward the door, but the soldiers blocked her path. Her composure cracked, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the ugly truth beneath the polished surface, the desperation of a woman who knew her scheme had been discovered. "This is her fault," Cecilia hissed, pointing at Eleanor. "The penniless nobody who thought she could steal my place. I was supposed to be the Duchess. I was supposed to have the northern votes and the French alliance and everything. But he chose her instead. He chose a bankrupt merchant's daughter over me." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Stratton's face hardened into grim realization. "Take Miss Radcliffe into custody," he said, "and release the Duke immediately." Later that night, in the quiet of the Ashworth House library, Eleanor sat beside Alexander as the fire burned low. The soldiers had found everything: letters, coded messages, a journal detailing years of correspondence with French intelligence. Cecilia Radcliffe had been arrested, and the evidence against her was damning. The succession crisis had been averted, The king was recovering, and the threat that had loomed over the kingdom for months was finally ended. But Eleanor could not stop trembling. "You could have been killed," Alexander said quietly, "if Stratton had believed her instead of you. If the evidence had not been found. If anything had gone differently." "I know," Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, "but it didn't." He turned his chair to face her fully. In the firelight, his sharp features were softened, his dark eyes unreadable. "I have spent 8 years believing I was beyond love," he said. "Beyond companionship, beyond anything except duty and silence, and the slow march toward death. And then you walked into that church in your borrowed gown, and you looked at me like I was not a cripple, or a recluse, or a ghost. You looked at me like I was a man worth fighting for." Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You are. You have always been. I love you." The words were rough, unpolished, utterly sincere. "I did not expect to. I did not plan to. But I love you, Eleanor. And if you will stay with me, not because of a contract or a settlement or a debt, but because you want to, I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." Eleanor reached out and took his face in her hands, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw beneath her palms. "You already are," she said. "You were worthy the moment you chose me, the moment you told me the truth, the moment you let me fight beside you instead of hiding me away." She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative. Then Alexander's hand came up to cup the back of her head, and he kissed her with a fierceness that stole her breath. 8 years of loneliness and longing poured into a single moment. When they finally parted, Eleanor was smiling, and so was Alexander, a real smile, wide and warm and unguarded. "The gossips will talk," she murmured. "They'll say I married you for your money. They'll say you married me out of desperation. Let them talk." Alexander pulled her closer, his arms surprisingly strong around her. "We know the truth, and that is enough." Outside the library windows, the first light of dawn was breaking over London. Inside, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth sat together in the fading firelight, beginning the rest of their lives. And somewhere in Berkeley Square, Cecilia Radcliffe was led away in chains, proof that those who laugh at love often fail to recognize the strength of those they mock. The crippled Duke had found his match, and she had found her home. 6 months later, at a ball in honor of the king's recovery, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth made their first formal appearance together since the scandal. Eleanor wore a gown of midnight blue silk, her hair dressed with sapphires that Alexander had given her on the morning of their wedding anniversary. She walked beside her husband's chair, with her head high, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The whispers still followed them. Some were curious, some were admiring. A few, from the darkest corners of the ballroom, were cruel. But when Alexander reached up and covered her hand with his own, when he looked up at her with those dark, watchful eyes and that crooked smile she had come to treasure, Eleanor found she did not care about any of it. She had married the crippled Duke for £40,000 and a chance at survival. She had stayed for love, and as they moved through the glittering crowd together, two survivors who had found each other against all odds, Eleanor knew that every whispered insult and mocking laugh had been worth it, because the ghost Duke was a ghost no longer, and his Duchess would never be invisible again.